I've been lurking here for years but never thought I'd have a story worth posting. But then this thing happened, and, honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I'm not a writer, just an average guy, so bear with me if this gets a little rambly. I'm just going to lay it all out and hope you guys can help me make sense of it. So, my name's Alex, and I've been married to my wife, Jane, for about 3 years now. We're pretty simple folks, nothing too fancy. We live in this nice little lake house that we saved up for, and we love it out here. It's quiet, peaceful, and the perfect getaway from the daily grind. Jane and I both work pretty stressful jobs, so our weekends at the lake house are our time to unwind, hike, swim, and just enjoy each other's company. Last weekend was supposed to be one of those perfect weekends. We had this amazing day planned. We'd wake up early, go for a long hike, chill on the beach for a bit, and then head back to the house for a romantic evening, just the two of us. We'd been looking forward to it all week, especially since work had been kicking our butts lately. But then my grandpa Joe showed up. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my grandpa. Joe is a tough old guy, a war vet, and one of those salt-of-the-earth types. He's the kind of man who doesn't take crap from anyone and has a million stories about the good old days. I grew up idolizing him, and even now, as an adult, I still think he's one of the coolest people I know. But he's also a little intense. The guy doesn't really believe in giving people a heads up before he shows up. He just kind of appears. That's exactly what he did last Saturday. Jane had gone ahead to the house after our hike to set up a surprise for me. She's always been the more adventurous one in the bedroom, and we've been trying to keep things spicy, even after a few years of marriage. Meanwhile, I decided to stay on the beach for a bit longer, crack open a beer, and just soak in the last rays of sunlight. That's when I saw Joe's old truck pull up. I was surprised, of course, but not totally thrown off. He's done this kind of thing before. I figured he was in the area and decided to drop by for a visit. I waved him over, and he trudged across the sand, looking a little winded but smiling that big, toothy grin of his. "Hey, kid," he called out, his voice carrying over the waves. "Thought I'd find you here." "Grandpa, what are you doing here?" I asked, genuinely curious. He shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Was passing through. Thought I'd drop by, see how you two are doing. You know, your grandma used to love this lake." We spent the next half hour catching up, talking about the usual stuff, how his garden was doing, the latest drama with his neighbor, and how he thinks the government is out to get him. The usual. I kept glancing at my watch, though, thinking about Jane and the surprise she had planned. But I didn't want to be rude. I mean, it's not every day your grandpa just shows up out of the blue. Eventually, the sun started to set, and I figured it was time to head back to the house. I invited Joe to stay for dinner. Jane and I always make too much food anyway, and I knew she wouldn't mind. He agreed, and we walked back together, talking about nothing and everything, like we always do. By the time we got back to the house, it was dark. I could see the lights on inside, and I felt a little flutter of excitement thinking about Jane waiting for me. I hadn't told Grandpa about the surprise, of course. That would have been awkward as hell. "Come on in, Grandpa," I said, opening the door for him. "Make yourself at home. I'll get dinner started." Joe nodded and walked in, but then something strange happened. He paused in the doorway, sniffing the air like a bloodhound. I didn't think much of it at first. He's always been one of those people who notices every little thing. "What's that smell?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I sniffed the air too, but all I could smell was the faint scent of vanilla. Jane must have lit some candles or something. "I don't know," I said, shrugging it off. "Probably just Jane setting the mood." Joe gave me a funny look, but then he nodded slowly. "Right. Setting the mood." He didn't sound convinced, though. And before I could stop him, he started walking towards our bedroom. "Hey, wait," I started to say, but he was already halfway down the hall. I followed him, my heart pounding a little faster now. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I knew I had to stop him before he walked in on something he definitely didn't want to see. But I was too late. Joe pushed the door open, and I saw it all happen in slow motion. The room was dimly lit, with candles flickering on the nightstands. Jane was on the bed, tied up with silky ropes, just like she'd planned. But instead of the playful, seductive smile I was expecting, her face was twisted in surprise, and maybe a little bit of fear. Grandpa Joe just stood there, staring at her with wide eyes. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then Joe let out a strangled gasp, like he was choking on air. His face went pale, paler than I'd ever seen it, and his hand clutched at his chest. I knew something was wrong, horribly wrong, but I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. "Joe!" I finally managed to shout, but it was too late. He staggered forward, his legs giving out beneath him. He fell onto the bed, right on top of Jane. She screamed, struggling against the ropes, trying to push him off, but he was dead weight. Literally. Alex. Help, she cried, her voice trembling with panic. I rushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to pull Joe off her, but he was too heavy. I kept shouting his name, shaking him, but he didn't respond. He wasn't breathing. He wasn't moving. He was just gone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, before reality finally hit me. My grandfather, this strong, tough-as-nails man who had survived wars, heartache, and more than his fair share of challenges, was dead. And not just dead, but dead on top of my wife, in the most bizarre, twisted scenario I could have ever imagined. The adrenaline kicked in, and I scrambled to get him off her. I'm not a small guy, but lifting his lifeless body was harder than anything I've ever done. Somehow, I managed to roll him onto the floor, where he lay completely still, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Jane was sobbing, her hands still tied, and I realized in my panic that I hadn't even thought to untie her. I fumbled with the knots, my fingers shaking, and finally got her free. She threw her arms around me, trembling, and we just stood there for a moment, holding each other, neither of us knowing what to say or do. Alex, oh my God, Alex, she kept repeating, her voice muffled against my chest. I know, I whispered, trying to keep it together. I know, baby. It's gonna be okay. But I didn't believe that. How could it be okay? My grandpa had just died, right here, in our bedroom, in the middle of this. I didn't even have the words for it. Finally, I snapped out of it and grabbed my phone to call 911. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial the number. When the operator picked up, I could barely get the words out. My grandfather, he's had a heart attack, he's not breathing. I need help. The woman on the other end of the line was calm, asking me questions, trying to get details, but I could barely think straight. I gave her our address, told her what happened, or at least, the basics of it, and she assured me that help was on the way. Then we just waited. Jane and I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at Grandpa Joe's body on the floor. The room was still filled with the scent of vanilla, and the candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It felt surreal, like some twisted nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The paramedics arrived first. They rushed in, all business, and quickly assessed the situation. But there was nothing they could do. Joe was gone. They told me that it was likely a massive heart attack, probably brought on by stress. I couldn't help but think that if I'd just told him to wait in the living room, if I'd just been a little quicker, maybe he'd still be alive. But it was too late for what-ifs. The police showed up next, and that was a whole other level of awkward. Jane and I had to explain what happened, without going into too much detail, of course. They took our statements, asked a million questions, and then finally, after what felt like hours, they took Joe's body away. It was the worst night of my life. The next few days were a blur. We had to call my parents and let them know what happened, and that was a conversation I never want to have again. They were devastated, of course, but they understood that it was an accident. I didn't tell them the full story, though. I couldn't. How could I explain that Grandpa died while trying to rescue my wife from a situation that was supposed to be a kinky surprise? The funeral was small and somber. Joe didn't have a lot of family left, but the few who were there were heartbroken. I gave a eulogy, talked about all the good times we had, all the lessons he taught me. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the image of his lifeless body, the way he just collapsed. Jane was my rock through all of it. She kept telling me that it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done. But I could see the guilt in her eyes too. We were both haunted by that night, and it put a strain on our relationship. How could it not? We stopped being intimate for a while. Every time we tried, I'd see Joe's face, hear his last gasp, and I'd shut down. Jane tried to be understanding, but I knew it was hard for her too. We were stuck in this weird limbo, neither of us knowing how to move on. One night, about a month after everything happened, Jane finally broke down. We were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless TV show, when she just started crying. I held her, trying to comfort her, but I felt so helpless. I can't stop thinking about it, she sobbed. I can't stop thinking about what happened. I feel so guilty, Alex. If I hadn't set all that up, maybe he'd still be here. Jane, it's not your fault, I said, trying to sound convincing, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. He had a heart attack. It could have happened anywhere, anytime. But it didn't, she whispered. It happened because of what we were doing. He thought I was in danger, and he died trying to help me. I didn't know what to say to that. I just held her tighter, wishing I could make all of this go away. As if things weren't already messed up enough, about 2 months after Joe's death, I got a call from a lawyer. Apparently, Grandpa Joe had left me something in his will. I wasn't expecting much, maybe his old watch or something sentimental like that. But when I showed up at the lawyer's office, I was in for a surprise. The lawyer handed me a small, old-fashioned key. "What's this for?" I asked, turning it over in my hand. "It's for a safe deposit box," the lawyer explained. "Your grandfather left instructions that you were to receive this key upon his death, and that you were to open the box alone." I was puzzled, but curious. Grandpa Joe had always been a bit of a mystery, but this was on another level. The next day, I went to the bank, found the safe deposit box, and opened it. Inside, there were a few old documents, some photos of my grandmother, and a small, velvet-lined box. I opened the box, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. Inside was a diamond necklace, one I recognized from old photos of my grandmother. It was stunning, probably worth a small fortune. But what really caught my eye was the note tucked underneath it. It was in Joe's handwriting, shaky but still legible. "Alex, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm sorry for what happened, I never meant to put you in such a difficult position. But I have to tell you something important. That necklace belonged to your grandmother. It's worth more than you can imagine, but it's not just about the money. It's about the family legacy. I want you to have it, but I also need you to protect it. There are people who know about this necklace, dangerous people. I kept it hidden all these years, but now it's your responsibility. Don't trust anyone with it, not even the police. I'm counting on you, kid. Keep it safe. For the family. Love, Grandpa Joe." I sat there, staring at the note, my mind racing. What the hell was this? Dangerous people? A family legacy? I had no idea what Joe was talking about, but I knew one thing for sure, this was far from over. After finding the necklace, things took a turn for the worse. I started getting strange phone calls, blocked numbers, no one on the other end, just heavy breathing. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a coincidence, but the calls kept coming. Then, one night, I noticed a car parked across the street from our house. It was there for hours, engine off, lights out, just sitting there. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't tell Jane everything, I didn't want to scare her, but I did tell her that we needed to be careful. I didn't want to worry her, but I could see the fear in her eyes every time the phone rang or she caught me looking out the window. Then, one night, it all came to a head. It was late, and Jane was already in bed. I was sitting in the living room, staring at the necklace, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do. That's when I heard the sound of breaking glass. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy candlestick, and crept toward the noise. My hands were shaking, and I was sweating bullets, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I reached the kitchen, I saw a shadowy figure standing by the broken window, rifling through our drawers. I didn't think, I just acted. I raised the candlestick and swung it as hard as I could. There was a sickening thud, and the figure crumpled to the floor. I stood there, panting, the candlestick still in my hand, staring at the man I'd just knocked out cold. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, ready to fight, but it was Jane. She was standing there, wide-eyed, holding a phone. "Alex, what the hell is going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know," I admitted, my own voice shaking. "But I think it's about the necklace. Grandpa, he left me something, and now someone's after it." Before I could explain further, the man on the floor groaned and started to move. Jane let out a little scream, and I quickly knelt down, pulling the man's hood back to see his face. He was middle-aged, with a scar running down the side of his face. He didn't look like a common thief, more like someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Why are you here?" The man smirked, despite the blood trickling from the side of his head. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," he hissed. "Give it to me, and I might let you live." "Tell me who sent you," I insisted, tightening my grip on the candlestick. He chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You really don't know what you're dealing with, do you? That necklace, it's more than just jewelry. It's a key. And now, thanks to your grandfather's little stunt, everyone knows you have it." "What do you mean, a key?" Jane asked, her voice trembling. But the man just shook his head. "Too late for explanations. You've already signed your death warrant." Before I could react, he lunged at me. We struggled on the floor, rolling around, both of us fighting for control. Jane screamed, but I couldn't focus on anything except keeping the man from getting the upper hand. Finally, I managed to land a solid punch to his jaw, and he went limp. I pushed him off me, gasping for breath, and grabbed the phone from Jane's trembling hands. "We need to call the police," I said, my voice ragged. "We can't handle this on our own." But before I could dial, the man on the floor stirred again, this time with a sinister smile on his face. "Go ahead," he taunted. "Call the police. See how far that gets you." My hand hovered over the phone, uncertainty gnawing at me. Something in his tone made me pause, made me question everything. I glanced at Jane, who looked just as terrified and confused as I felt. "What do we do, Alex?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. "We're leaving," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling around us. "We're taking the necklace, and we're getting out of here. We'll figure this out somewhere safe." Jane nodded, her eyes wide with fear but filled with trust. We quickly packed a few essentials, grabbed the necklace, and headed out the door, leaving the unconscious man behind. As we drove away from the lake house, my mind raced with questions. Who was that man? What did he mean by the necklace being a key? And what had Grandpa Joe gotten us into? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure: we were in deep, and there was no turning back. For the next few days, Jane and I were on the run. We drove aimlessly, avoiding major highways, switching hotels every night. I kept the necklace hidden, always within reach, but the weight of it felt heavier with each passing day. We didn't dare use our phones or credit cards, afraid that whoever was after us could track us down. Every time we stopped, I would scout the area, paranoid that we were being followed. Jane was holding up better than I expected, but I could see the strain wearing on her. On the fourth day, as we were passing through a small town in the middle of nowhere, I noticed a black SUV in the rearview mirror. It had been tailing us for the past few miles, and my stomach churned with dread. "Jane, we're being followed," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She glanced in the mirror, her face going pale. "What do we do?" I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "We need to lose them. Hang on." I floored the gas pedal, swerving onto a side road and speeding through narrow streets. The SUV stayed close behind, relentless. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, my heart pounding in my chest. We weaved through traffic, dodging cars and pedestrians, but the SUV kept gaining on us. I could see the driver's determined expression in the mirror, his eyes locked on us like a predator closing in on its prey. Finally, I spotted an alleyway up ahead, a narrow gap between two buildings. It was risky, but I didn't see any other choice. I yanked the wheel hard to the right and sped into the alley, tires screeching on the pavement. The SUV tried to follow, but it was too wide to fit. The driver slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just as we disappeared from view. I didn't slow down, though, not until we were well out of sight and the alley opened up onto another street. I kept driving for another hour, making random turns, taking back roads, until I was sure we'd lost them. Only then did I pull over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Jane was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "Alex, I don't know how much more of this I can take." I reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, Jane. I'm scared too. But we can't stop now. We have to keep going." She nodded, wiping her tears away, and I saw a flicker of determination in her eyes. "You're right. We'll get through this. Together." That night, we found a cheap motel on the outskirts of another small town. The room was dingy, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew, but it was better than sleeping in the car. I barricaded the door with a chair, just in case, and we both collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. As I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, my mind kept replaying the events of the past few days. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, some crucial piece of information that would make sense of all this. Finally, I reached for the necklace, holding it up to the dim light. It sparkled, beautiful and dangerous, and I couldn't help but wonder what secrets it held. "What are you?" I whispered, more to myself than to Jane. To my surprise, Jane sat up and looked at the necklace, her expression thoughtful. Maybe it really is a key," she said quietly. I frowned, turning the necklace over in my hands. "A key to what?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But think about it. Your grandpa said it was important, that it had to be protected. Maybe it's not just a key in the literal sense, but something more. Like a clue, or a map." The idea sounded crazy, but at this point, I was willing to consider anything. I studied the necklace more closely, searching for any hidden markings or symbols, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Frustrated, I let the necklace fall back onto the bed. "I don't get it, Jane. None of this makes any sense." She reached out and touched my arm, her gaze steady. "We'll figure it out, Alex. But we can't do it alone. We need help." "From who?" I asked, feeling a pang of hopelessness. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke with quiet determination. "From someone who knows more about this than we do. Someone we can trust." The next morning, after another restless night, Jane and I made a decision. We needed to find someone who could help us, someone who knew more about the necklace and the people after it. The problem was, we didn't know who to trust. But I had one idea, someone from my past who might be able to shed some light on this mess. His name was Carl. We'd served together in the military, and he was one of the few people I trusted with my life. After we both got out, Carl went into private security, more of the shady, under-the-table kind. If anyone knew about dangerous people and hidden secrets, it was him. I hadn't spoken to Carl in years, but I knew how to reach him. I just hoped he was still around, and that he'd be willing to help. We drove to a nearby city, using cash to pay for gas and food, and checked into another motel under fake names. I found a payphone and dialed the number I remembered by heart. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. A familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Who's this?" "It's Alex," I said, my heart pounding. "I need your help, Carl." There was a long pause on the other end. "Alex? It's been a while. What's going on?" I hesitated, not sure how much to say over the phone. "I'm in trouble. Big trouble. It's about something my grandfather left me. I think people are after it." Another pause, then Carl's tone shifted, more serious. "Where are you?" I gave him the address of the motel. He didn't ask any more questions, just told me to stay put and that he'd be there in a few hours. When I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Carl was the best bet we had, but involving him also meant dragging someone else into this dangerous situation. Jane was sitting on the bed when I returned to the room, her eyes filled with worry. "Did he agree to help?" I nodded. "He's on his way." We spent the next few hours waiting, both of us too tense to talk much. When Carl finally arrived, I barely recognized him. He'd aged, his hair grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Alex," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "It's good to see you, man. Wish it were under better circumstances." "Yeah," I agreed, shaking his hand. "Thanks for coming, Carl. I wasn't sure if you'd still be around." He gave me a wry smile. "Still kicking, for better or worse. Now, tell me what's going on." I explained everything, from Grandpa Joe's sudden death to the mysterious necklace and the men chasing us. Carl listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You're in deep, Alex. Real deep. This isn't just about some old piece of jewelry. Whatever that necklace is connected to, it's big. And dangerous." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "Do you know what it could be? What these people want?" Carl hesitated, then looked me straight in the eye. "I've heard rumors, stories about old family treasures that are more than just valuable. Some of them are tied to powerful organizations, secret societies, that sort of thing. If your grandfather was involved in something like that, it could explain why you're being hunted." My heart sank. "So what do we do?" Carl leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "We need to find out more about this necklace, who's after it, and why. But we have to be smart about it. No more running. We need to go on the offensive." I glanced at Jane, who was watching Carl with a mixture of fear and determination. "And how do we do that?" Carl's smile was grim. "I've got some contacts, people who owe me favors. We'll start there. But you have to be ready, Alex. Once we start digging, there's no going back. This could get a lot worse before it gets better." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision. But there was no other choice. We were in too deep to back out now. "Let's do it," I said, my voice steady. "Whatever it takes." Jane nodded in agreement, her hand finding mine. "We're in this together." Carl stood up, his expression resolute. "Then let's get to work. We've got a long road ahead of us." With Carl's help, we began to unravel the mystery behind the necklace. He reached out to his contacts, people who operated in the shadows, and started piecing together the history of the necklace and its significance. It turned out that the necklace was indeed a key, though not in the literal sense. It was a symbol of power, a marker that granted access to a hidden network of influential people. This network, known only as the Circle, had existed for centuries, controlling wealth and power behind the scenes. The necklace was one of their most guarded secrets, a token that granted its bearer entry into their ranks. Grandpa Joe, it seemed, had once been part of the Circle, though he'd left it years ago, taking the necklace with him as insurance. Now that he was gone, others in the Circle wanted it back, fearing that it could be used against them. As we dug deeper, we discovered that the men after us were not just thugs, they were part of a secret faction within the Circle, determined to reclaim the necklace at any cost. Their leader, a man named Victor Klein, was ruthless and powerful, with resources at his disposal that made our situation even more perilous. Carl suggested that we confront Klein directly, offering the necklace in exchange for our safety. It was a risky plan, but we were running out of options. We arranged a meeting through one of Carl's contacts, setting the location in a remote, neutral area, a derelict warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Carl, Jane, and I arrived early, scouting the place and setting up an escape route in case things went south. When Klein finally arrived, he was accompanied by two heavily armed men. He was tall, with a cold, calculating gaze that sent shivers down my spine. "You must be Alex," he said, his voice smooth but menacing. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." I forced myself to stay calm. "You wanted the necklace. Here it is." I held up the velvet-lined box, the necklace sparkling inside. Klein's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "Very good. Now, hand it over." I hesitated, glancing at Carl, who gave me a subtle nod. "Not so fast," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We want assurances. You leave us alone, and we give you the necklace. No more chasing us, no more threats." Klein's smile was icy. "You're in no position to negotiate, Alex. But I'll play along. Hand over the necklace, and you have my word that you and your wife will be left in peace." Something in his tone made me uneasy, but I didn't see any other option. I stepped forward, holding out the necklace. Just as Klein reached for it, there was a sudden noise, a loud crash from somewhere in the warehouse. Everyone froze, and Klein's men immediately drew their weapons, scanning the area. Carl was already moving, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. "We need to get out of here, now," he hissed. But before we could make a move, a group of masked men burst into the warehouse, guns blazing. The situation erupted into chaos, bullets flying as Klein's men returned fire. Jane screamed, and I pulled her down behind a stack of crates, shielding her with my body. Carl was firing back, trying to provide cover, but it was clear we were outnumbered and outgunned. In the chaos, I saw Klein trying to make a run for it, the necklace clutched in his hand. But before he could escape, one of the masked men tackled him to the ground. There was a brief struggle, and then Klein's body went limp. The man who had taken him down stood up, pulling off his mask. To my shock, it was one of Carl's contacts, the same one who had arranged the meeting. He glanced over at us, his expression grim. "It's over," he said, his voice echoing through the now-silent warehouse. "Klein's dead. You're safe." I slowly stood up, still holding Jane close, my heart pounding. What the hell just happened? Carl approached us, his gun still in hand, but his posture relaxed. "We had a contingency plan," he explained. "In case Klein tried to double-cross us. My contact here brought reinforcements. Looks like it was a good call." I stared at Klein's lifeless body, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. "So, it's really over?" The contact nodded. "As far as the circle is concerned, yes. With Klein out of the picture, the faction after you has lost its leader. The rest of them will scatter, too afraid to come after you now." Carl holstered his gun and put a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Alex. It's finally over." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, relief flooding through me. Jane and I exchanged a look, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. But even as we walked out of the warehouse, leaving the chaos behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The necklace, the secrets, the danger, it had all changed our lives forever. We were free, but we would never be the same. In the weeks that followed, Jane and I slowly began to rebuild our lives. We moved to a new city, far from where everything had happened, and tried to put the past behind us. Carl stayed in touch, checking in on us from time to time, but for the most part, we kept to ourselves, focusing on healing and finding some sense of normalcy. The necklace, we decided, was too dangerous to keep. After much deliberation, we found a way to safely dispose of it, ensuring it would never fall into the wrong hands again. But the memories of what we went through, the fear, the uncertainty, and the loss, lingered like shadows, always there, just beneath the surface. We had survived, but we had paid a price. And though we were free, we knew that the world was much darker and more dangerous than we had ever imagined. We had escaped the circle, but the scars it left behind would never fully fade. And so, we moved forward, together, knowing that our lives had been forever changed by the secrets we uncovered and the enemies we had made. But we were stronger for it, and as long as we had each other, we knew we could face whatever challenges lay ahead. We were survivors, and that was enough.